was Dean H. O'Banion. So the name Charles never even figured into it until later, and he may have just chosen that because that was his dad's name. But according to census records, as early as 1900, so he was only about 8 years old at the time. His name was Dean H. O'Banion. Of course, when he was locked up, the only time he was locked up was in Chicago in jail. He didn't actually go to prison. He went to the Chicago House of Corrections. He was listed as Dean A. O'Banion. So, but his name was always Dean. It wasn't Dion. I'm not sure where the Dion came from other than just in the newspapers of the time. But it was always, according to the census records, I mean, it was Dean H. O'Banion. And when he was murdered, it was Charles Dean O'Banion is what he was listed as.
Interesting. You know what I find interesting, if I can interject for just a second? If I read correctly and remember correctly, at some point in the early 20s, I guess, maybe before then, he was hanging on to the back of cars because, he was a thrill seeker like that, and a car rolled over on him and run him over and messed up one of his legs, so he had a limp for the rest of his life. Is that true?
It was actually when he was a kid. That was when he was a kid, so it had nothing to do with happening in Chicago. So supposedly there was a streetcar accident, but the only thing I could see is that in his World War I draft registration card, this was 1917, I think, when he filled out the draft registration. Supposedly it happened when he was a kid, and it may have been that he was messing around in a streetcar, but his leg was broken in two places, and that's why his left leg was an inch shorter than his right leg. And of course he had that. But even as a kid, he had kind of the nickname Gimpy, because of his leg. So it happened when he was a kid. So more than likely, I don't know if they had streetcars in Manoa where he was born. He lived there until at least 1900, until he was at least 8 years old, and then I think they moved to the Goose Island area. One thing I thought was funny about his mom, his original mom, not when after his dad got remarried, but his original mom, Emma, was still alive in 1900, although her tombstone says she died in 1898, which is really kind of weird. I'm not sure exactly when Emma died. I haven't really looked into it, but his mom, in her gravestone, that's actually back in Manoa before they left for Chicago. Or actually, I think they moved to Aurora first, and then went to Chicago. But her tombstone listed as 1898, but I found her in 1900 living. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I did something similar, Ray. I found her living up until 1901, and she supposedly died in 1901 from complications of tuberculosis.
Right, and it may have been the case, but for some reason her tombstone says 1898. Now that have been maybe family members later on put that. It looks like a newer tombstone, so it's probably family that really weren't aware of the situation or the actual dates or whatnot. Or maybe it's just the wrong tombstone altogether. I don't know.
It could be. It could be possible.
Yeah. So, but I know his dad eventually got remarried. I know his dad was still considered a widower in 1910 when Dean was locked up for assault and some other things, working as a shoemaker at the House of Corrections, which I thought was kind of funny. But I guess they were teaching people how to make shoes at the House of Corrections. I guess that was before license plates. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the big thing was shoes back then, I guess.
I guess.
You were working on the chain gang, you made shoes.
Yeah, you made shoes. What the heck? I mean, I don't know.
So this is what I was going to touch on. All of us have touched on this, but Ray, I like the way that you paint a picture. I like the way that you tell a story. So I wanted you to get into it again because this is kind of one of the most legendary things about O'Banion is his death, and because he was a florist and he was a flower shop owner. And
right.
Can you tell me the story, or as best as you know, the story of kind of what led to his demise and the story of his demise, the way it went?
Well, supposedly the last straw, according to the everyone kind of hated O'Banion only because, like I said, he liked to push the limits. He liked to see how far he could push the other side before he would either give up or just drive people completely nuts. And I think that's kind of what he did with the Jenner brothers, and that's kind of the beginning of the end for him. Was that like I said, he was not part owner, but he got money from a Cicero gambling establishment that was also the Jenners got money, and as well as the Capones, and it was kind of like understood that if one of the owners spent a little bit too much money and lost money, he would just forgive their debts. You're part owner. That's just kind of common courtesy, I guess, and O'Banion didn't like it because he felt like he was cutting into his portion of the money, and basically made a phone call to Angelo Jenna and said, yeah, you just need to pay up your debts. And then that's when they said, all right, enough's enough. We need to get rid of this guy. And that's when Angelo Jenna had what's his face. Actually, it was the whole setup was Jenna was pissed, and Jenna couldn't get the go ahead to kill O'Banion, because he had to get the approval from the head of the Sicilian, for lack of a better term, the Sicilian mob, which was different from the outfit, and they wouldn't agree to it. But then the head, Merlo, Mike Merlo, the head of the I guess they called it the Union, Sicily Union, or Union Siciliana, or whatever they called it, they couldn't get him to sanction the hit. But then he had developed some sort of terminal cancer, and then after he died, they're like, hey, we can just do this without his approval because he's no longer around. So that's when he sent these three guys in the show fields. It wasn't actually O'Banion shop. He had purchased his way in to be part owner of this floral shop that was right across the street from Holy Name Cathedral, and so it became the floral shop to the mob. Basically, every mob funeral, they got flowers from Schofields. That's where the mob got their flowers from, because O'Banion owned it, and that's when Jenna decided to send Frankie Yale and the two other hitmen, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, and kind of case the joint. And so they used Merlo's funeral, since Merlo had just died of terminal cancer, to kind of case the joint, get a feel for it. So that gave all these guys a reason to go visit O'Banion at the flower shop. And then, of course, on November 10th, that's when they went in, and O'Banion was, according to, legend, was clipping chrysanthemums. I don't know how true that is. I don't know if that ended up on a police report. The chrysanthemums were recently clipped or whatnot. But according to what happened is that Frankie Yale actually went in to make the arrangements, and then he kind of shook hands with O'Banion, grabbed his hand so that he couldn't reach for a gun, and the other two guys basically shot him in the chest and the throat, and then one of them shot him in the back of the head as they were leaving. So that was the end of Dean O'Banion and the flower shop. Now, he actually did like flowers. It wasn't the fact that that it was such a money-making venture with the floral shop, but he did enjoy working with flowers and stuff like that. So it did give them somewhat of enjoyment working there. But it was that was the end. It was they didn't machine gun them. They just walked in and shot them, and that was kind of about it. But and then of course then Bugs Moran kind of took his place, and that set up the beginnings of the big war between the North Side and the South Side, bootleggers, and then ultimately ending with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Yeah, and one of the things about O'Banion, and I don't know that he began this, but he was also one of the people that was he was dead then, but he participated in his own way in the large, lavish funerals that these mobsters got in Chicago. And I think maybe it was somebody before him that started that, but it may have been O'Banion. Talk a little bit about that. These huge funerals for criminals.
Oh, there was always the Rago Funeral Home was a big one. That's still around in the same location. The Rago Funeral Home was big, but there were big lavish funerals. Technically, I mean, Mount Carmel Cemetery is where Dean O'Banion's buried, and Mount Carmel has a reputation of being the cemetery of sinners and saints in Hillside, Illinois, because you've got both sides of the spectrum. You have the mausoleum to the archbishops of Chicago, which is right there, kind of dead center in the cemetery, and then you also have the mobsters, which were primarily, buried in Mount Carmel. Capone's there, Jenna's there, O'Banion's there. Most every famous mobster that has been dispatched is at Mount Carmel, and along with the archbishops of Chicago. So you got both ends of the spectrum at the cemetery. And they would have lavish funerals. You'd have big funerals. A lot of people would show up. You'd have, of course, the FBI. Well, there was no FBI until a little bit later, but until you get into the later 20s, mid to late 20s, they were all watching the funerals. So I know that if you go to some of the Chicago Crime Commission files at the History Museum, you'll see surveillance reports detailing, the cops going to the funerals and writing down plate numbers and getting to know who showed up at the funeral and which politicians and which judges and which, and they could get an idea of who's tied in just by going to the funerals. So, but that's always been a big, even in the movies, that was always a big part of the murders. There'd be a huge, huge funeral. And it was kind of I don't want to say controversial. What's the word I'm looking for? It was a touchy subject when it came to burying the mobsters, because I wasn't aware until I started looking into some of the mob stuff that there could be unconsecrated ground within a Catholic cemetery. I always thought that the whole cemetery was considered consecrated ground. But I guess certain areas are and certain areas aren't, and if you were a high-profile mobster, you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, and I guess with Dean O'Banion he wasn't, and eventually one of the priests that kind of knew him from the old neighborhood kind of worked his magic, and he was later on moved to consecrated ground.
It's crazy that I was looking at about O'Banion is that he was only 32 when he died. That seems crazy to me that he was a mob boss, that he started the North Side Gang and he dies at 32. That seems considerably young for such a, I don't know, a legacy.
It's kind of like bikers, you have some old gangsters and you got some bold gangsters, but you don't have any old bold gangsters, it's like, if you can keep a low profile, and you don't stir up a whole lot of problems, you usually can live a lot. But when you start making the news and you start getting your name out there, that's the one thing that, they want to make the money, they don't necessarily want the fame. And once they become famous, then they become a liability, because then everyone's gunning for them and they're a target. And a lot of times their own guys will take them out just to keep them from narking. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Blake, do you want to get any last thoughts on O'Banion and the North Side Gang here, buddy?
Oh, sure. Ray just summed it up so nicely. It's very hypnotizing to listen to him talk about it. But and that may be because he's been drinking and I haven't been. I don't know what the exact reason is.
I've definitely been drinking, so I don't know how hypnotizing I am.
But it seemed to me, and this isn't necessarily specific to Chicago, even though, these events were. It seemed to me that politics and the mob sort of go hand in hand, like the mob and alcohol, or the mob and, racketeering and all this, that, and the other. And when I was a younger man, I used to really love studying Tammany Hall and that whole situation going on up in New York during the 30s when Judge Crater disappeared. And I always wondered your opinion, Ray. Do you think the mob had anything to do with